In this series, lowimpact.org talks with people working to build a mutually owned, democratic, decentralised economy that builds community and doesn't destroy nature. We want to increase collaboration to bring about system change. Find links to the sites mentioned in the videos in the description below. Join the conversation by liking, commenting and subscribing to our channel.
Today I'm talking with Julian Jones, a water engineer, distinguished fellow of the Schumacher Institute. He's worked and provided consultancy for water companies, NGOs, the Environment Agency, universities and governments. Julian lives in a village near Stroud, and we're talking with him about building a water commons for Stroud. Welcome, Julian.
Thank you, Dave, and thanks for inviting me.
Start with a big question. The water companies seem to be struggling. What's wrong with the water industry in the UK? It's a big one, I know, but can we break it down?
Okay, well, it's a huge problem, not only specifically in terms of the water industry, but it's analogous to the wider problems with our capitalist system. So it's a huge story. I'll just try and touch on the key points. It's as Joseph Chamberlain told us in 1884, there's just a profound conflict of interest between the public interest and the pursuit of profit in terms of the business of water, both water and sewerage. Wastewater services are fundamental to how we manage our landscapes and catchments, you know, from the way we farm through to the way we recycle our nutrients. Yeah, I mean, clearly with the grotesque growth in sewage pollution that we've seen in the last few years, which I'm happy to detail the reasons why. It's just been an ever downward spiral, frankly, but it does go back to the founding principles of the privatization. It's getting worse, and it frankly can only continue to get worse.
Can you describe how did we get to this situation, and tell us how bad it is?
Well, I mean, how bad it is. So public health is a big part of my professional remit as a wastewater engineer. I started my career in microbiology for Wexham Park Hospital near Slough. And one of the key things you learn there is that feces or excrement is the biggest source of all infectious material, bacteria, pathogens, parasites. So it always was a huge mismatch, frankly, and that's putting it very politely, between the public interest and the ability of the water companies to continue to put sewage into our rivers. So I have an honorary post at Gloucestershire NHS, just in terms of validating any of the things I'm going to tell you, but it's horrendous. And you know, for a long time we were told, oh, you shouldn't swim in rivers because of Weil's disease, which is spread by rats' urine, and yeah, that's a real risk. But the reason I took up my voluntary work, and I continue to follow the excellent Agenda 21 principles, which in theory, you know, we all signed up to locally and internationally to achieve a sustainable outcome in terms of our economy, and should apply to the water industry. Yeah, there's just been this horrendous oversight in not applying public health standards to our rivers or seas. So all the sewage surcharges, to use the technical term, the overflows that are occurring, and in Stroud we've had them up to 100 times a year. They come from, as the water industry says, a myriad of reasons: lack of investment, wet wipes, blocking sewers. But fundamentally, to answer your question, it comes back to the fact that we live in a flush and forget society. And wastewater services have always been pretty low on the public's agenda. You know, we've got to acknowledge the heroes who are really shaking things up right now. I mean, of course, they're reacting to a precipitous decline in service standards. I used to get agitated at the time of the privatization because our sewers were licensed to overflow 6 times a year in Stroud. They're now overflowing 100 times a year. And it's been due to people like Fergal Sharkey, the former Undertones lead singer, Professor Hammond at Windrush Action on Sewage Pollution. They've really taken this all up to the next level. Frankly, shown us all up, particularly those of us already trying to fix the problem. But in terms of trying to engage on this, I mean, in terms of my own defense, we, and I've always worked within a collective. I'm a professional engineer, so I only work on request. So I got involved in the early 1980s, having lived in Stroud throughout my childhood, but then gone away to pursue my career. But then returning because of the growing problem in the run-up to water privatization. So Margaret Thatcher cut back investment. This was part of her austerity at that time, cutting back on public spending to try and boost the economy. And specifically in the case of the water industry, it was because apparently it needed major investment. Well, this is one of the 2 deeply flawed pieces of logic behind the water privatization. Actually, the solutions are not expensive. The naturalistic solutions that ironically we had in the Victorian era, but weren't applied to municipal wastewater. Treating water with plants. We have 100-year-old working withy or willow treatment systems still operating to this day in Gloucestershire. And that technique, phytoremediation, cleaning water with plants, has been taken vastly further forward since that historic.
You're talking about reed beds.
Reed beds now, yeah. But I'm just working on a local system that I was involved with setting up 30 years ago. It's a large private house. And there we used a combination of reed beds and a swale. And the swale is a withy bed. It's a willow bed. The client is very interested in supporting craft work and basketry. So once a year, the willows are cropped of the willow whips, and they go off for basketry. The population at this large property has quadrupled over its original design flow in the last 30 years. And there's been a shocking problem. No pollution, I hasten to add. Why? Because the willow bed has held up and captured most of the nutrient. I would say the treatment is adequate. It needed improvement. If you quadruple the throughput on a wastewater treatment system, you're going to run into trouble eventually. But with a phytoremediation system, generally this will be fairly slow, and you can catch it before there's a catastrophic failure. And that's what we've done. The client pulled us back. And so we've refurbished the reed bed. We've changed the planting medium because actually it can cope with this quadrupling of throughput. So, and the design there was exactly the design that we offered the local water company many years ago, Reed and Swale, just to capture these overflows. So, this design was pretty obvious during we worked on it in the 1980s, me and other older mentors. I mean, my work is, based on the generation that went before. I had reed beds explained to me when I was 11 or 12 years old. All I've done is validate and refine the technology.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, we're talking about how we bring the water industry into community ownership, but you're also very, very much talking about how we can build a really sustainable, natural water and sewage system as well.
Yeah, I mean, in the case of this large country house, the key problem is, there's been a slight decline in standards, not to the extent it's caused any pollution. the main problem is it's just been producing too much compost. It's been overflowing with compost. So, and compost is a fantastic way not only of mopping up nutrient, which our rivers and aquifers are absolutely awash with because of our subsidized chemical farming practice.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll come back to later on in this conversation. But it's a resource, and when our local government, in terms of just going back to that horrendous public health problem, we had huge problems with meningitis in Stroud in the 1980s, and that was why I was asked to get involved by local residents who felt there was a connection, and almost certainly there was. I have an honorary post at the NHS because of that likely connection. And it's not come about from people falling in the river or swimming in the river. It's likely come about by fecal particulates spraying off the weirs. Now, when you look into this, of course, it's not sensible to spray communities with fecal particulates.
I wouldn't have thought so.
And when I spoke to the public health laboratories at Colindale in the early 80s, they told me, oh no, there was no evidence that this was a problem. I've learned subsequently that they worked on this in the 1960s. I know the name of the man who did it. And it's an horrendous problem. And when the then doctor, now Professor David Wheeler, published his work in 1989, demonstrating that sewage viruses live for many, many months in the sea, and I rang him up at the Robbins Institute and said, so they live for months in the sea, how long do they live in fresh water? There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and he said, you really don't want to think about that. It doesn't bear thinking about. So, so basically we never finished the amazing job that Bazalgette started, and what Bazalgette achieved for us in the Victorian era, which was undoubtedly the greatest advance in public health of all time. I mean, the health gains from improved sanitation and specifically from clean drinking water, because that was what Bazalgette did. He excluded fecal pathogens from drinking water. This was the huge public health gain. But he did it by pouring the surcharges, what we call storm overflows, just straight into the river. And this is not only an unacceptable risk to public health, it's a shocking waste of resources. This is nutrient that we could be doing something useful with. So coming back, if I may, to this point about what was wrong with the structure of the water privatization, by perpetuating the myth that it was expensive to fix our wastewater problems, our sewerage problems, not only did they give the water companies a carte blanche, frankly, to make colossal profits, because part of the problem in their regulation is that their profits are calculated as a percentage of costs. So they don't have an interest in cheap solutions. And they got themselves, some of the water companies have now got themselves into an even bigger hole now, because they've taken out crazy loans. One water company has debts of £14 billion. Another one, the next one down, is £7.2 billion. Well, to service that debt, they need high profits. So they're even less likely now to want low-cost solutions than before. So it was, if you like, misconception number one in the privatization. Misconception number two was that this was a natural monopoly. Well, if there's sewage pouring out of overflows left, right, and centre all across the country, quite apart from the fact that Section 94 of the Water Acts requires that the water undertakers, as they're called, effectually drain the areas that they're responsible for, and overflows at 100 times a year, frankly, is not effectually draining the area, then clearly a dispersed small-scale solution is appropriate.
Yeah.
So in terms of it being a natural monopoly, it is a natural monopoly where no one cares about it. And I would say, and just an interesting anecdote, because I was a wastewater engineer at high level until 1984. I worked primarily in the agricultural sector, but I worked for a fantastic continental company who stressed several things to me and my colleagues. I think this is very relevant because this has since come up with the wonderful work of the late Polly Higgins in Stroud. It was stressed to us, for me, this was in the mid-70s. Privatization hadn't been mentioned then, but I'm coming now to one of the other key problems that Joseph Chamberlain, frankly, was touching on as well. This continental company that was family owned basically told us we weren't in business to make a huge profit. We were in business to make the world a better place. That was the key ethos of the company that I was working for. Sadly, the family sold up and the business was handed over to money managers. So, and that coincided then with me watching this horrendous decline in wastewater standards at that time in the run-up to privatization. And
really, so talking about scale, you and I are part of a group in Stroud, and we're interested in building the commons economy.
Yeah.
I'll put a link. It's stroudcommons.org. Is this something that can be applied to the water industry? In other words, can water provision and sewage treatment be owned by communities rather than by corporations?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it already is. There's still many private water supplies operating in and around Stroud and elsewhere across the country. For 30 years, up until recently, I was managing such a private water supply. It gave me invaluable insights into changes in the landscape, which have been affecting water availability. That might be something for another time. It's quite complex, but it's completely contrary to what we're being told about the water shortages. And in terms of wastewater, Water21 is presently representing a local school, a secondary school, who decided to take control of their surface water drainage when the school was refurbished. In fact, it wasn't just a decision of county council who were responsible for this. It was a requirement of, I think it was the 2005 Stroud District Planning Policy, which was that any new developments should capture all surface runoff. So they did precisely that. They put a storage water pond within the school grounds, and the water company accepted that as fine. And then all of a sudden, in 2013, 2014, the water industry hit a crisis. We were working for one of the water companies who actually even then said, look, we've got a real problem. We can't see a way to stay in business. And in classic, I suppose, British fashion, the regulators and the water companies fudged it. They allowed the rules to be bent. We'd already seen a return to self-regulation on sewage pollution. It was very interesting in the run-up to privatization. We were told, the old water authorities were no good because they combined the poacher and the gamekeeper within the organization. We've gone back to the combined poacher and gamekeeper. The water companies are, in theory, regulating their own sewage discharges, but other things were allowed as well. A retail market. Well, retail racket, I think, is probably the word that should be used here, because in the case of this school, they suddenly started getting from their new water retailer, and changed. The local water company hadn't changed, but the company who was marketing and submitting the bills to them had changed. And they started getting bills for £7,500 a month for surface water drainage. Well, there was none. This half-acre pond captured more than adequately. I mean, apparently the school has never seen more than an inch in the bottom of this pond, and it's got 2-meter high banks. So it's being designed with vast overcapacity. Suddenly this retailer expected £90,000 a year for surface water drainage duty function that this half-acre pond was providing. Well, The sewer catchment, it's not on the Stroud sewer, it's an adjacent catchment. That also surcharges between 50 and 100 times a year. So, and quite apart from the fact that actually the water company is not offering a safe and effective drainage service, very clearly, all those landowners running along the length of that sewer, sewage treatment works are normally, and we should really go into this because it's this flush and forget mentality that prevails in our society. Sewage works are normally placed on the parish or the district boundary. You know, we get them as far away, for some understandable reasons, from habitation as possible. So, you know, this is all part of the disposal ethos that was privatized and then fossilized within the water industry. Yeah, so but that sewer, as a consequence of the sewage works being remote from the urban centre, has got countless fields and open space running 90% of its length, where I'm sure local landowners or and here's the big or, community groups, rivers trusts, might like to set up their own community or commons-owned wastewater treatment services. And, you know, if the water companies don't want to do their bit for carbon sequestration by turning this stuff into compost, using a methodology that's at least 90% cheaper than the hard civil engineered methods that they use. I mean, again, you know, one of the saving graces of the water privatization was the need for competition. So let's have some competitive community solutions.
Yeah.
If you like our channel, please consider liking this video and subscribing. The more people like our videos and subscribe to our channel, the more the YouTube algorithm will share them. It doesn't cost anything, so please press the like and subscribe buttons. And if you click the bell icon just underneath as well, you'll get a notification when we upload a new video. Thank you.